подвесишь, я уже здесь не говорю. Давай, конечно, давай. Ко мне прям подводи.
Станок не ставить, еще.
Что, можешь еще? Оп. И оп, вот вообще. Все, да, ну давай сейчас. Игорек, ну там пятно, Игорек, это, знаешь, такая модель. Да, то есть она как называется? Конденсат, что ли? Но они там не капли, там смотри. Ну, Игорек, что? Ну там нет, там такое же, там скопилось, знаешь, как это. А что такой грязный объектив полиции? Он вообще весь горит. Ну да, да. Я еще сейчас шок протру, подожди. Хорошо.
Все будка пристроена не знаю, да. Заряд, давай. Заряд.
Внимание! Говорит и показывает Москва. Слушайте и смотрите Красную площадь. Парад Победы!
Парад! Под государственный флаг Российской Федерации и знамя Победы! Смирно! Для встречи слева! Накра!
Военнослужащие почетного караула вносят на Красную площадь государственный флаг Российской Федерации и знамя Победы в Великой Отечественной войне. 77 лет назад бойцы 150-й Идрицкой стрелковой дивизии в ходе штурма Берлина водрузили на Рейхстаге алое знамя Победы над поверженным фашизмом. Сегодня почетное право нести флаг Российской Федерации и знамя Победы предоставлено лучшим военнослужащим 154-го отдельного комендантского Преображенского полка, сержантам Антону Михайлову и Дмитрию Монастыреву. Возглавляют знаменные группы старшие лейтенанты Валерий Золотухин и Геннадий Звонков. Лет назад.
Hello, good morning from the Telegraph offices in London. We're welcoming you to the live footage of Moscow's Victory Day parade, started about a minute ago. I'm Dom Nichols, the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor. I'm joined by Theo Mers, our Assistant Foreign Editor. And we're going to be covering this for a couple of hours actually. We're going to be having a look at what's happening on the parade, and what we're likely to see, and possibly more importantly what we're not going to see. More of that later. We'll be discussing the war in Ukraine and what the latest events have been over the weekend and where we are.
And I think we'll also be looking especially for what Putin says during his speech, which will come at some point. During this parade, there's been a lot of speculation that he might step the war up to another level, that he might announce mobilization of the Russian population. We're unlikely to get any details of that, but we may see the rough outlines of the next stage of the war is going to take.
So sit back, grab a cup of tea, grab a vodka, wherever you are in the world, whatever mood you're in, and we will take you through this as best we can.
Вольно!
You used to be our Russia correspondent, and I think you were at the parade, weren't you, last year?
I was actually watching from the streets of Moscow, like many people do. I wasn't on Red Square. This is Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister.
So this is Red Square in the centre of Moscow. That's the Kremlin that's just gone out of shot to the right. That's St. Mark's Cathedral,
St. Basil's
St. Basil's
Cathedral,
Cathedral, sorry. So this is right in the heart of Moscow.
It's an absolutely incredible space. I think it's one of the few world sights that you see and it doesn't look smaller or less impressive in real life. And there's so much Russian history there. The St. Basil's Cathedral in front, Kremlin to the right, and then the GUM department store on the left, which we just had a shot of, which is where the Soviet elite used to do their shopping, get their groceries, and now it's where rich Russians get their Armani and their Louis Vuitton. It's a high-end department store.
Is that it in the
Moscow.
background?
Yes,
that,
that's it.
That's the GUM department
that
store
you're seeing now.
So
yeah.
not accessible to ordinary Russians?
Well, I mean, everyone can go in there now, but they wouldn't be able to. Not everyone would be able to buy Louis Vuitton.
77-й годовщины Победы в Великой Отечественной войне построены командующий парадом генерал армии Салюков.
So this is a Victory Day parade. It's happened every year since the Second World War. It is there to mark and celebrate the Second World War generation's victory over Nazi Germany. So there will be some equipment, particularly T-34 tanks from the Second World War. We'll see a little bit later. Of course, in recent years, it's also being used as a showcase for Russia's military might.
Поздравляю вас с 77-й годовщиной Победы в Великой Отечественной войне!
There have been a number of rehearsals in recent weeks, right up to yesterday actually. We saw some photographs. The equipment we're going to see on display today, including, we are led to believe, a procession of MiG-31 fighters, quite an old fighter, but MiG-31s in the Z formation, Z being used as a symbol of the war. It's actually a tactical recognition marker for Russian forces in Ukraine to know who's who, but it's been used as a wider symbol in society to mark support for the war. So Theo, what's the kind of mood in Moscow on a day like this?
Well, it's a public holiday, so normally it's quite upbeat. It's not that everyone is watching this parade either on TV or in real life, though many millions are. But you know, it's the start of spring, the end of the long Moscow winter, and it's generally quite there's a festival atmosphere, not just in Moscow, but in cities and towns all across Russia where they have parades like these, not with the same level of military hardware, but even in really quite small places there'll be parades of veterans or cadets and celebrations and fireworks later in the evening. So it's not entirely, or not everyone who is watching it is entirely buying into this display of military might. It's not quite as saber rattling for all Russians as the images that we're seeing now might suggest, though obviously this year there'll be a very different mood in Moscow. A lot of opposition-minded Russians live there and in St. Petersburg, who will be against this war and will feel deeply uncomfortable about this display while it is happening.
And of course, this isn't the only one. As you said, it's happening across Russia and elsewhere. We are told that there'll be some form of Victory Day parade in Mariupol, the besieged coastal city in Ukraine. There will be other parades, other events such as this across other parts of Russia. We're not sure if there will be other things happening in Luhansk and Donetsk, the separatist-held eastern regions of Ukraine. But we did hear overnight that there will not be a parade in Belgorod. That's a Russian city about 100 kilometers inside Russia. It's been subject to a number of attacks suggested by Ukrainian forces, possibly even by local saboteurs in recent weeks. But there will be events like this happening, not on this scale, but across much of Russia.
What we're seeing now is Sergei Shoigu, the defense secretary, going and addressing various sections of the Russian army that are represented here, and he's congratulating them on the 77th anniversary of the victory in what they call the Great Patriotic War in Russia, rather than the Second World War.
And it's interesting that this is Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, doing this bit. Are we going to see Valery Gerasimov, the head of the armed forces, shortly? Is he going to go and take a load of salutes, or is this it before Vladimir Putin turns up?
I'm not sure. It is normally Shoigu who does this bit of driving around in the car, and then I think he will address Putin later, and then Putin will speak. I can't remember whether I've seen Gerasimov in these parades before, because obviously he was in Ukraine quite recently, wasn't he?
Yeah, he went down, we think, for about 3 or 4 days to the Izium region, probably to shake a fist and try and get things moving. There were reports actually that he'd been injured in an artillery strike. We now think that's largely discredited. There was an artillery strike that day on the location he visited, but we're not sure if the timings worked out, and suggestions that he had been injured, I think, were overblown at the time. Certainly he's been seen since and is suffering no obvious injury from that visit. He's likely to be up on the podium because Putin will see up on a podium by Lenin's mausoleum, won't we? Is that where the main sort of stand is?
It's just to the left of the image that we're seeing now, so where Shoigu is walking.
Okay. And that's the mausoleum to the left there?
Товарищ Верховный Главнокомандующий Вооруженными силами Российской Федерации. Войска Московского гарнизона к параду готовы.
Telling Putin that the parade is ready, addressing him as the commander-in-chief of the Russian armed forces.
Уважаемые граждане России,
dear citizens of
дорогие
Russia,
ветераны,
dear veterans,
товарищи солдаты и матросы,
soldiers
сержанты и
and
старшины,
Navy officers, sergeants,
мичманы и прапорщики, товарищи офицеры, генералы и адмиралы.
officers, generals, admirals.
Поздравляю вас с Днем Великой Победы.
I congratulate you on Victory Day.
Защита Родины, когда решалась ее судьба, всегда были священны.
When our nation's fate was decided, will always be a sacred memory.
За отечество ополченцы Минина и Пожарского шли в атаку на Бородинском поле, бились с врагом под Москвой и Ленинградом.
He's listing areas where there was particularly heavy fighting: Moscow, Kiev, Minsk, Stalingrad.
И Харьковом. Так и сейчас.
Areas in
В эти
Ukraine.
дни вы сражаетесь за наших людей на Донбассе.
Then as now you're fighting for our people in the Donbass, for our nation in
9
Russia.
мая 1945 года навеки вписано в мировую историю как триумф нашего единого советского народа.
The 9th of May will go down in history as a triumph for us, the Soviet people.
Беспримерного подвига на фронте и в тылу.
A feat both at the front and at home.
И дорог каждому из нас.
It's dear to all of us.
Нет семьи, которую бы не опалила Великая Отечественная
In Russia, there isn't a single family that hasn't been touched by this.
В этот день в нескончаемом потоке бессмертного полка дети, внуки и правнуки героев Великой Отечественной.
They'll be remembered today in the immortal regiment. People holding pictures of their relatives. This is going to happen in Moscow after the parade.
Мы гордимся непокоренным, доблестным поколением победителей.
We're proud of the war generation, the generation of victors.
Хранить память о тех,
Our duty is to preserve the memory of those who allowed us to be these victors and did everything so that a global war would not be repeated.
В международных отношениях Россия всегда выступала за создание системы равной и неделимой безопасности.
Russia has always supported a system of equal global system of security. In recent years, we've tried to pursue security talks. We've entered into honest dialogue. Everything was in vain. People didn't want to listen to us. They had completely different plans. And we see that now.
В открытую шла подготовка к очередной карательной операции на Донбассе, к вторжению на наши исторические земли, включая Крым. В Киеве заявляли о возможном приобретении ядерного оружия. Блок НАТО начал активное военное освоение прилегающих к нам территорий.
NATO is actively pursuing our territory.
Для нас угрозы.
This is an absolutely unacceptable threat to us.
Все говорило о том, что столкновение с неонацистами, бандеровцами, на которых США и их младшие компаньоны сделали ставку, будет неизбежным. Повторю.
We're talking about neo-Nazis. In Ukraine, the USA and its junior partners are working with.
Шли регулярные поставки самого современного оружия из стран НАТО.
Ukraine is getting deliveries of the most modern weaponry from NATO.
Это было вынужденное, своевременное и единственно правильное решение.
The decision for this special military operation was forced, timely, and the only correct decision.
Соединенные Штаты Америки, особенно после распада Советского Союза, заговорили о своей исключительности.
The USA, after the fall of the Soviet Union, was speaking about its exceptionalism.
Которым приходится делать вид, что они ничего не замечают, и покорно все это проглатывать. Но мы другая страна. У России другой характер.
But we're a different country. We have a different character.
От веры и традиционных ценностей,
from faith and traditional values.
От уважения ко всем народам и культурам.
We have respect for all people and cultures.
Тысячелетние ценности, судя по всему, решили отменить. Такая нравственная деградация стала основой циничных фальсификаций
He's talking about the moral degradation of the West, which is a favourite topic for him. Talking about the rise of Russophobia.
Издевательство над памятью жертв, перечеркивание мужества тех, кто добыл и выстрадал победу. Нам известно, что американским ветеранам, которые хотели приехать на парад в Москву, фактически запретили это делать.
So, American veterans wanted to come to the Victory Day parade in Moscow, but they were practically banned from doing so.
Мы чтим всех воинов союзнических армий, американцев, англичан, французов, участников
We remember
сопротивления,
all the victims of all Allied armies, France, England, Germany, everyone who helped defeat Nazism.
Сегодня ополченцы Донбасса вместе с бойцами армии России сражаются на своей земле, где разили врага дружинники Святослава и Владимира Мономаха, солдаты Румянцева и Потемкина, Суворова и Брусилова, где насмерть стояли герои Великой Отечественной войны: Николай Ватутин, Сидор Ковпак, Людмила Павличенко. Обращаюсь сейчас к нашим вооруженным силам и к ополченцам Донбасса.
Talking about the fight ongoing in the Donbass now, the people fighting for their nation, for their future, for people who have not forgotten the lessons of the Second World War and the victory over Nazism. Today we bow before the memory of everyone who lost their lives in the Second World War. In the memory of the sons, the fathers, the mothers, the daughters, the grandfathers, the husbands, the wives, brothers, sisters, friends and family.
Мы склоняем головы перед памятью мучеников Одессы, заживо сожженных в Доме профсоюзов в мае 2014 года.
We remember the people who died in the fire in Odessa in 2014. Remember the peaceful civilians who died in the Donbass.
Мы склоняем голову перед нашими боевыми товарищами, которые пали смертью храбрых в праведном бою за Россию.
We remember people who've died fighting for Russia.
Минута молчания.
And now we're going to observe a minute silence.
Уважаемые товарищи, гибель каждого нашего солдата и офицера – это горе для всех нас и невосполнимая утрата для родных и близких. Государства, регионы, предприятия, общественные организации сделают все, чтобы окружить заботой такие семьи, помочь им. Особую поддержку окажем детям погибших и раненых боевых товарищей. Указ президента об этом сегодня подписан. Скорейшего выздоровления желаю раненым солдатам и офицерам. И благодарю врачей, фельдшеров, медсестер, медицинский персонал военных госпиталей за самоотверженную работу. Низкий поклон вам за то, что боретесь за каждую жизнь, часто под обстрелом на передовой, не жалея себя. Уважаемые товарищи, сейчас здесь, на Красной площади, плечом к плечу стоят солдаты и офицеры из многих регионов нашей огромной Родины.
Here on Red Square, many soldiers from different regions from all across our country.
Прямо из Донбасса,
Some have come straight from the Donbass, who've come immediately from a fighting zone.
Мы помним, как враги России пытались использовать против нас банды международных террористов.
we
посеять национальную и религиозную вражду.
remember
Чтобы
how
изнутри ослабить, расколоть нас.
enemies have tried to use
Ничего не получилось.
terrorism against us or terrorist
Сегодня
groups.
наши бойцы разных национальностей вместе в бою прикрывают друг друга от
Soldiers of different
осколков,
nationalities
как
are now
родные братья.
fighting with us. He means
И в
nationalities
этом
within
сила
Russia.
России. Великая, несокрушимая
That's the
сила нашего
strong,
единого
that's the strength
многонационального
of
народа.
Russia, that we have many
Сегодня вы защищаете то,
nations.
за что сражались отцы,
many
деды,
nationalities.
прадеды. Для них высшим смыслом жизни всегда были благополучие и безопасность Родины. И для нас, их наследников, преданность отчизне – главная ценность, надежная опора независимости России.
All of these people fighting for the independence of
Те,
Russia.
кто сокрушил нацизм в годы Великой Отечественной войны, показали нам пример героизма на все времена.
Those who defeated Nazism showed us an
победителей.
example of
И мы всегда будем
heroism for
равняться
all
на них.
time, and will always
Слава нашим доблестным
strive to
вооруженным
compare
силам!
to them
За Россию! За победу!
for Russia
Ура!
for victory. Can I- there was one. There was one bit that he was saying where it's slightly cut out on my feed, but it sounded like he was announcing a presidential decree to support the families of people who'd died or been injured in Ukraine, but I would need to check that just to add to what I was saying.
Okay, Kate, happy to go live here, Kate. Good morning. You join the Telegraph for a live broadcast of the Victory Day parade in Moscow. I'm Dominic Nichols, the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor. I'm joined by Theo Mers, our Assistant Foreign Editor, who's just done a sterling work translating President Putin's speech. There's much more yet to come. I'm not sure if Putin's going to speak again. But interesting, Theo, he was just obviously welcoming everyone to the parade and thanking everyone for their sacrifice in the Second World War. But he very quickly changed it to referring to the war in Ukraine, and mentioned there were some fighters who had literally come straight from fighting in the Donbass to be here in Red Square today. And you were saying when we were off air briefly that it's unusual for him to be so forthright against America, to actually mention America by name. That was quite a bullish commentary. He's not yet, as we suspected he might do, not yet said anything about declaring war or broadening out the offensive in Ukraine, but seems quite a bullish start, Theo. What do you think?
Yes, he talks. Last year he talked about Russophobia, and he talked about the increasing threat from the West, and this is rhetoric that has been ramping up all throughout his time in power. But I think it is quite unusual for these speeches for him to mention the USA by name and say that they are working with neo-Nazis in Ukraine to undermine Russia's interests, essentially. He talked about the US and its junior partners, by which he means Europe and the UK. But then at the same time he said, well, you know, in the USA they don't recognise the role that Soviet veterans played in World War II, but we, in this benevolent gesture, we of course recognise the sacrifices that France, the UK and the US made. So, and also part of his speech, he was saying that we Russia, we Moscow, have tried to enter into international security agreements or respect international security agreements. We've entered these talks in good faith about NATO, and we weren't listened to. So what we're doing now in Ukraine is absolutely necessary and a forced move, which is all of more or less what he has been saying on and off since the start of the conflict. But it's interesting to hear it here in this setting that is normally, always has strong elements of current Russian politics, but for it to be so tied up with what is ostensibly an occasion to honour those who died in the Second World War. I mean, it was half and half Ukraine, half and half the war victory, or I mean, really all Ukraine. This is all about the conflict that is happening at the moment.
Yeah, I was quite surprised that within about 3 or 4 sentences he'd got onto the war in Ukraine very pointedly, which I was a little surprised at. I mean, he veered very quickly away from the veterans of the Second World War, who you can see around him on the podium. There's many people there, as every year, a number of veterans alongside Putin. But no, very quickly shifted it to talking about the Ukraine. It's quite specific terms, talking about fighting in the Donbass and mentioning some towns by name, Izium and what have you. So yeah, I mean, fairly bullish start there from Putin. And you think maybe, you would have to listen back, but you think maybe a presidential decree to help the families of lost servicemen, but nothing yet as strong as has been suggested about using the war word or broadening out the attack in Ukraine.
I think it would have been strange to use this speech to call for a general mobilisation or any significant strategic change in the war, which doesn't mean that we won't hear about that later today or from other figures. Putin's not going to speak again, or he doesn't usually give another speech like that. But yeah, like I say, just because he hasn't announced a change in aims now, it doesn't mean that it won't come today or it won't come in the next few days. I think also we've seen that Russia doesn't like it very much when Western intelligence predicts exactly what they're going to do. We saw that at the start of the war when Western intelligence was saying it will be, I think, this Wednesday or whatever date it was, and then nothing happened. Some Russian officials came out and said, well, there you have it, Western intelligence making stuff up again. Of course, there's not going to be a war. And then a few days later, it did happen. So it may be that because people in the West are predicting that this day will be a turning point, that the decision has changed about when to announce it.
I mean, they've said that a number of times. They've said quite repeatedly up to February the 24th, there was no plan for an invasion. This is all completely made up by the West. So I was actually in Moscow with the Defense Secretary about 3 weeks before the war started, and in fact we were there in Red Square, and Ben Wallace said he was in. We went to the Russian Defense Ministry and he met with Sergei Shoigu and Valery Gerasimov, so the Defense Minister and the head of Russia's armed forces, and they assured him that there was no invasion planned. And he said, what can you do? You've got to all you can do is eyeball them and say, are you going to invade Ukraine? They said no. That's about as much as any foreign diplomat can do. But as Mr. Wallace says, you've got to take these people at their actions rather than their words. So he said it was extraordinary being in the Russian Defense Ministry, listening to them making these assurances, and he said at the time he was thinking there could very easily be an office somewhere else in this building with large maps of Ukraine and big arrows and all the rest of it, and it seems like that was the case. It was interesting. Moscow with the Defense Secretary, hadn't been there since a school trip in 1986. There we go, hadn't changed much.
Is there anything from the what was there anything I missed?
Theo, rather interestingly, we're now seeing reports from Russian state media that the air parade today is cancelled due to bad weather. I mean, we've got that from a number of different sources, also from the website of Russian state media. That would be very surprising. Firstly, the weather doesn't look too bad. I mean, it's a bit windy. I mean, you can see there's sort of overcast, but I used to fly helicopters for the British Army. I've flown in a lot worse than that. That would be surprising, would it not? Because there were suggestions that the whole parade is going to be about a third down in terms of equipment numbers on what it normally is, because so much equipment has been lost and so much is deployed. That was going to include the air element, and a lot of the air element, we were told, would have been made up with old MiG-31 fighters. But now to say they're cancelling the entire air element is notable, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't understand. Well, you will probably have a better idea of why that might be, or whether that's because of shortages, or I don't know or understand why that might be. But it was certainly planned that this was happening, because there have been rehearsals over Moscow, I think, for the last week or so.
Yeah, up to yesterday, I think we saw the Z formation of MiG-31s.
It's quite amazing being in Moscow the week before Victory Day parade, because you'll sort of be at work or walking along the street and then suddenly see this formation of fighter jets flying overhead, and you think, what is going on? And then remember that it's this parade next week. Though I imagine that would feel very different now that Russia is actually at war, or at least carrying out this quote-unquote special operation against Nazis in Ukraine. It must have a very different feeling seeing these fighter jets in the air, even in the run-up to this parade, even if you do know that it's a rehearsal for this.
How long were you there for?
I was there I was a correspondent there most recently for 4 years, but I've been coming and going sort of since my degree in Russian, and it has been amazing to see. So I've sort of seen the latter. I've been there since 2007, 2008, so I've sort of seen Putin 2.0 after he left and came back, after he left the Kremlin and was Prime Minister for a while. And it's been amazing to see how Victory Day has changed and how it has become this massive thing where children are dressed up in Red Army uniforms, and relatives of people who lost their lives in the war now do this huge march through the centre of Moscow after this parade, where they're holding up pictures of their relatives, which Putin mentioned in his speech. They call it the Immortal Regiment, and it's all about establishing this emotional link to the Second World War, and this emotional link to a Russian or Soviet victory. It's celebrating this idea that they're a nation of victors, and it has been celebrated every year since the end of the Soviet period. It actually wasn't celebrated every year in the Soviet Union. They had these parades on and off, but it's just taken on this huge significance and has become this absolutely unescapable thing now.
Can I just butt in there, Theo? The standards we're seeing there in the background, those large scarlet ones, that they've got the CCP for USSR, the old Soviet Union, and pictures of Lenin. Now Lenin he died in 23, I think, so although he was a founding father of the Soviet Union, he wasn't around in the Second World War. Is that normal to see pictures of Lenin on an event like this?
It's because it would have been the banners that they fought under in the Second World War. So they would have, even though Stalin was in charge and had taken the country in a different direction and reformed the Soviet Union in his image, it was still this idea that it was a Lenin-Stalin joint endeavour, and that's why he's still got his own mausoleum on Red Square. That he was sort of deified after his death in a way that he personally didn't want to be at all. So yes, it is normal that those are on the banners. That we're not bringing back Lenin.
Right. Stalin, who was actually a Georgian by nationality, seems to be conveniently forgotten modern Russia. So when you were there, did you feel a change in atmosphere towards you as a Westerner and towards you as a journalist over the years you were there? Did you notice a change in the attitude from the state and from people to you at all?
Yeah, I think I noticed that very dramatically from the first time I went there in 2008, when Russia was a really open society and there were a lot of Westerners there, and it sort of wasn't remarkable that I was foreign or that I was learning Russian. And then when I went back in 2017, I think things had really changed. It was post-sanctions. There weren't so many foreigners there. It was sort of slightly more hostile, though Russia still felt a bit open to the world. That they had the World Cup there shortly after I came, and it was quite open in that way. But then ever since, I think the story of me being there, I mean, when you're a correspondent and you leave somewhere, you sort of think, okay, so what was all that about? And the narrative through my time there was just it was getting more and more authoritarian and more repressive, and opposition jailed, Alexei Navalny poisoned, protests not allowed to happen, increasingly strict punishment for people who were protesting. So yes, I think the attitudes towards the West and towards journalists has changed. And I was speaking with a friend in Moscow this morning, a Russian friend. I was asking her what the mood was like on the streets there. I mean, she's not pro-Putin by any sense, so I knew she wasn't going to say it's wonderful and I'm down near Red Square. But she said it's back in the USSR, like this feels like the Soviet Union.
Wow. And when you say hostile to you, how did that manifest itself? Are we talking kind of Parisian waiter hostile, or telling jokes at US passport border control hostile?
I think it's more that speaking as a journalist, you're very aware that they are reading what you're doing and they are keeping a really close eye on you. And there's one of the Maria Zaharova, who we are writing about increasingly because she talks about the war in Ukraine and gives us some of our sort of strangest quotes about it. She really keeps personally quite a close eye on journalists, and she does these weekly briefings and will sort of go after them. And it's quite it sort of does add a pressure, and you are aware when you're writing something that, okay, the person who approves me being here and a person who really holds quite a lot of power in an authoritarian regime will probably be reading that. And as well as that, with covering protests, it used to be that even when I started back there in 2017, it used to be you could quite safely or reasonably safely go there as a journalist. You had your press pass, and you might get sort of grabbed by police if they think that you're part of the protest, but you show your press pass and then you get they let you go. Whereas now you can quite easily be arrested as a journalist and detained. And I mean, not put in jail, but our Moscow correspondent Natalia Vasilyeva, before she had to leave because of this new law that they brought in about spreading fake news about the Russian army, she was detained during a protest, and that's something that would have been unimaginable on the scale that we're seeing it now, sort of 10 years ago. So it is getting harder to, well, it's a bit more or less impossible to work there now as a correspondent with the news that is going on. I'm amazed at what the BBC is doing, and some of the wire services like Reuters and AFP still have staff there, but the newspapers in general, us included, don't, because of the security risks. So that really does feel sort of beyond Soviet.
So here we go. This is the start of the equipment moving through Red Square. We're not going to do a running commentary on every piece of equipment. It would get very, very quickly boring to tell you about two S6 artillery pieces and all the rest of it, mainly because I'll get it all wrong. But we start off with the T-34 tank, the tank that won the Second World War, or kept the Soviet Union in the Second World War and enabled it to win. These were almost like the Sherman. They were simple, easy to produce, and they were produced in their thousands and just pushed out. And I mean, they were a good tank anyway, but they were just, the numbers were just so incredible that they were able to overwhelm what was left of the German army on the Eastern Front. So that always leads this parade. There's normally more of them, but I mean, they're very old, so unsurprisingly, some of them aren't in great nick. But no, that's the T-34 tank that's held in a special place in Russian military hearts. Then we get all the modern kit. So these are the armoured personnel carriers that are seen in Ukraine today. And again, interestingly, that they're, I mean, all right, these are nice bits of kit, but essentially just armoured trucks. Not hugely impressive. We'll get on with some other stuff later, I'm sure, but it will be interesting to see what mix of equipments they go for. BMPs, Boyovaya Mashina Pekoty, I seem to remember. 30mm cannon. On those things on either side of the cannon are the Cornet anti-tank guided weapons. They are, oh no, that's a T. Having said I wasn't going to do a running commentary of all the kit, but there's a new family of vehicles. So these ones at the front are the old BMP, the old infantry fighting vehicles. There is a new family of Armata vehicles, and we get very excited by the T-14 Armata and the T-15, but so far they've only been seen in, well, they're not mass produced yet.
And are these the tanks that have been in the Donbass?
Well,
do we know that?
Yes, we think all tanks have been in the Donbass. These, oh, Craig, it was flicking around here, but I mean, so in the Russian inventory today, you've got a few T-64, you've got a huge number of T-72, a small number of T-80, and an even smaller number of T-90. T-72 is the Ford Escort of the Russian tank fleet. It's just, they're still produced today. I mean, 72, it was designed and built in the 70s, or since the 70s, and it's been upgraded over time. So the later version, more modern versions. Okay, I'll just pause for a moment. That is the T-14 Armata. This is the new super tank that was unveiled first of all in 2015 on this Victory Day parade, and everyone went, "Oh my God, that's an amazing tank! How are we ever going to compete with that?" Never gone into mass production. The thing about it is that it removes the crew from the turret, so the crew are in the compartment. We'll cut back in a minute. Those are artillery launchers. That's a Brone transporter, people carrier. But the thing about the T-14 Armata is it puts an armoured compartment in the front of the hull, which is where the crews sit, to remove them from the turret. Because as we've seen from Ukraine, the turret is the thing that pops off if all the ammunition inside explodes. So in a bid to try and protect the crew, the T-14, first of all, has only a three-person crew. In the Western forces, we go for 4, but also puts them forward in the hull. But as I said, I mean, we can look at these things. They're essentially one-off. I mean, they are not in mass production. They're not deployed. They're not in Ukraine. So we should be cautious about looking at some of these images and going, "Oh wow, they've got amazing equipment." Yeah, equipment's one part of military capability. You've got to be able to use it, train it, keep it sustained. And they've not been able to do that with the T-14 Armata. So this is the MSTA artillery piece, 152 self-propelled artillery. I don't know what MSTA stands for, but it's one of the only things I can remember, because I just remember it as the massive, stupid turret full of artillery, MSTA. It's just huge. And it's these artillery pieces. The current fight in the Donbass is a bit of an artillery duel between Russia and Ukraine, because the long-range artillery is pounding Ukrainian positions and also civilian areas. And unlike their fight in the north, Russia has got their sort of combined arms manoeuvre together to operate underneath that blanket of artillery, to use their tanks and infantry much better coordinated. So the fight at the moment in the Donbass is to push that artillery coverage back, such that the Russian forces are exposed underneath. And that's why Ukraine in recent weeks has been calling for heavy artillery. from the West. These, I think, are, I'm going to possibly get this wrong, I think those are Iskander missiles, the short-range ballistic missiles, again, which have caused a lot of damage, especially in civilian areas. Most of the Russian equipment now that they're using in Ukraine, and that we're probably going to see today, are unguided. They're not precision weapons, and therefore result in a lot of death and destruction in civilian areas. So again, it's not just having the equipment; it's being able to use it effectively. And precision is the name of the game these days in military forces. And what's called dumb bombs, i.e., just going by physics, just going ballistically, are very unreliable, inaccurate, and easy to produce. And we think Russia has just huge stockpiles of unguided munitions, but really that's not an effective way of wielding military force these days. So this is Russia's main intercontinental ballistic missile. That's a nuclear weapon there being carried on that massive low loader. They normally put these out at the Victory Day parades. That in and of itself is not unusual. Putin and the senior military leaders refer to the use of nuclear weapons quite a lot. It's something we find, or we used to find, very, very upsetting in the West, because we just don't talk about it. Our military leaders and political leaders very, very rarely talk about nuclear weapons and when they might use them or under what circumstances and so on and so forth. So to be dragged into this debate by Russia felt very uncomfortable a few weeks ago. Now it's less so, and like I say, not unusual to see the Yars nuclear missile there on the parade today. So that thing, please Twitterati tell me if I'm wrong. I think that is the new boomerang. This is supposed to be the next infantry fighting vehicle. You can see it's much bigger than the BMPs that we saw before. But again, it's not in mass production. It's been developed, it's been trialed. We've seen it for a few years now, but it's not out there. I mean, Russia is the war in Ukraine is not going well. So you'd think if they had all this amazing kit, we would have started to see it in the last few weeks, and we just haven't. So these equipments are largely, I mean, they're not experimental because they are out there, but they're in such small numbers that you can hardly call it an effective capability. Sure, yeah. Good morning from the Telegraph in London. It's 9 a.m. here in London. We are watching live coverage of Russia's Victory Day parade from Red Square in Moscow. It started about an hour ago. We see Mr. Putin there and Sergei Shoigu as defence minister. They've just left the stage and are heading off. Good morning and welcome. I'm Dominic Nichols, the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor. I'm with Theo Mers, our Assistant Foreign Editor, and we've been having a look at what's been on display. And Theo has done a valiant effort of live translating Mr. Putin's speech. So far, we have not seen anything too far out of the ordinary. There were suggestions that Mr. Putin might use this occasion to widen the war in Russia, or use the word war and explain that it got to the degree that he needed to mobilise the country. That has not happened. However, as Theo knows far better than me, his speech was quite strident. He was fairly vicious in some of his language about NATO. Mentioned NATO and the war in Ukraine very early on in his speech, earlier than we were expecting. So it was quite boisterous, but didn't go as far as to say there was now war in Ukraine. And then on the equipment front, nothing that we were not expecting to see. We are told that because of bad weather, although it looks very nice to us on this feed, because of bad weather, the air parade has been cancelled. But Theo, what did you take from his speech?
I think his speech was more or less what we've been hearing from him throughout the conflict, that this is NATO aggression, that the West was preparing to attack Russia, so that Russia was forced to act. It tried to enter into dialogue with the West to avoid this war, but the US and its partners weren't listening. So all of this is what he has been saying, what we expected him to say. There was some speculation, as you say, that he would use this opportunity to ramp up the war, announce mobilisation. I thought it was quite unlikely that he would do this at this occasion that is ostensibly to mark the end of the Second World War, the Soviet victory over Nazism. But as I mentioned earlier, I think it's possible, if there is going to be an escalation or mobilisation, that we will hear about it from someone else later today, that the Defence Ministry or the Kremlin will put out a statement. So just because it hasn't been mentioned by Putin, it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. But in general, the tone of his speech was aggressive, probably more aggressive than we've seen in recent years, even when he has been attacking the West for Russophobia, but it hasn't really changed the terms of this war or how Russia is presenting its role in it.
He's now just walking down the, let me see, is that the...
He's walking by...
he's walking down the south side of the Kremlin, I think. And he's going to go round to the east side, to the tomb of the unknown warrior, and lay a wreath there, I believe. Of course, there has been speculation recently about his health. A number of suggestions that he's suffering from cancer and Parkinson's, and he's on steroids, and hence he's looking a little bit sort of puffy around the face. I mean, I'm no medical expert. I can't tell from looking at him there, but there has been speculation here. I don't think it was ever in doubt that he was going to attend today. Are these stories, do you think there are any credibility to them, Theo?
It's very hard to tell. There have been some quite well-sourced stories in Russian independent media from sources, or purporting to be from sources close to Putin, that he's followed around by a cancer specialist all the time. I think last year there were reports that he had Parkinson's. That we don't know. What we do know is that he is he's still taking COVID very, very seriously. And at the start of the pandemic, anyone coming into contact with him had to isolate for 2 weeks, had to pass through a disinfectant tunnel. I don't really know how that works, or whether it does actually protect from COVID. And since foreign leaders have have been coming to Russia, he has been keeping them at a great distance, as we've seen with his absolutely gigantic table that he has got out when I think Emmanuel Macron was one of the leaders that was subjected to that. Kept really a distance away from Putin at all times. Yeah. And I think there has been some speculation, I think probably rightly, that this level of isolation throughout the pandemic has influenced his decision to launch this war, because as well as being increasingly isolated in the way that authoritarian leaders always are after too long in power, they're surrounded by yes men, nobody dares contradict them. He's also really been very physically isolated for the last couple of years, which of course does have an effect on decision making, and has given him a lot of time out of the day-to-day running of a country. Not that he was doing a great deal of that anyway. He tends to be more interested in foreign affairs and geopolitics and Russia's standing on the world stage. But it has taken him out and given him time to think about these historical questions that has led him to the conclusion that now is the time to launch this invasion of Ukraine.
I mean, the man he's speaking to there, Sergei Shoigu, the defence minister, he's known to be very, very close to him, and to listen to him as one of his senior advisors. He appointed Shoigu in 2012, so he's been there, a long time. I mean, this is a pointed display of unity. We've not seen Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, anywhere yet. I don't know if that is normal for this parade, but certainly, I mean, Putin is not speaking to anybody else. We saw the camera cut away briefly as he left the main area of where the audience were, briefly hovered on the head of the SVR, the Overseas Intelligence Service, whose name, forgive me, escapes me briefly. But he was given a massive dressing down, public dressing down in the National Security Council just ahead of the war, and then subsequently, since the war has gone on, there's a lot of fingers, certainly from the military, being pointed at the SVR and the intelligence agencies. So I think it's quite interesting that he, the leader, the head of the SVR, was just in the stand, and he's nowhere near the sort of inner circle, and he's definitely not now here anywhere near Putin. Look, he's absolutely sticking to Shoigu. Do you think it's significant that we've not seen Lavrov?
It's hard to say. We haven't seen very many people from government, now you pointed out, which isn't to say that they're not there, just that the camera hasn't got them. We saw Dmitry Peskov, Vladimir Putin's spokesman. He's been his spokesman for a long time, but we haven't seen Lavrov, we haven't seen the Prime Minister, we haven't seen many other ministers here, but we need to check that against previous years to see what is going on there. It is absolutely amazing that we are back to this sort of Kremlinology where we actually have no idea what is going on, because it's so closed now, and it's so little access for anyone that you're having to scour images from Victory Day parades in the way that people did in the Cold War. That how close is this person to the leader? Where are they standing? What does that mean for them? It's absolutely incredible that we are doing this again. It will be an interesting exercise to compare it to previous years and sort of see whether we can work out from that who's in and who's out.
So this is the tomb of the unknown warrior on the far side of the Kremlin. I'm not even going to try and guess which cardinal point. I've got that wrong already, although you can probably tell by the angle of the sun there and the shadow. Tomb of the unknown warrior. This is when I visited with Defence Secretary Ben Wallace a few weeks ago. He was invited to do this. I mean, the wreath wasn't quite that big, but it wasn't short of it. I mean, they did lay on the bells and whistles for the British Defence Secretary, even though they were clearly then lying to his face. But yeah, so this is a very somber and poignant moment for Russia, for Russians. They really do they draw their identity to a great extent back to the Great Patriotic War, the Second World War, and the fight against Nazism, which is obviously why they've drawn such parallels, or tried to draw parallels in Ukraine with all the language about neo-Nazis and what have you. So if it goes to form with what happened with Mr. Wallace, the soldiers will place the big wreath down, then Mr. Putin will step forward, pause briefly, and then he will move forward to the wreath. He will adjust a couple of leaves and a couple of bits and bobs on the wreath, and then he will step back again. He has to sort of make the final. The guest of honour has to make the final adjustment. So here he goes. He sort of leans in, shifts a couple of bits around. Yeah, just make sure it's absolutely correct. Yeah, and then steps back. This is exactly what Ben Wallace did. Yeah, I'm not trying to detract from it. This is a sombre occasion. Anyone who wants to celebrate fighting against Nazis gets my vote. So, you know, this is one of those rare times, like a stopped clock that tells the correct time twice a day. I'm with Putin on this one, but you won't often hear me say that. So now he's laid the wreath. This is the ceremony drawing to a close, been quite noticeable, Theo, that there haven't been many, I won't say any yet because we haven't seen the entire feed, but many foreign dignitaries. I mean, it's not, President Bush has appeared here in the past, it's has got to that level, and yet very obvious today that this was an all Russia affair.
Yeah, I mean, the Kremlin did say in advance that there wouldn't be representatives of foreign countries at the parade, and that really is the story of the Putin years. That when this parade started in 2000, it was not when this parade started in 2000. When Putin became president in 2000 and started giving his speeches here, it was a sort of international affair, and even Western leaders were invited, and then in recent years it was tended to be leaders from former Soviet countries, and this year, as far as we know, no one at all. Russia completely isolated, not even Lukashenko, the Belarusian leader, not even leaders of former Soviet countries that Putin has helped out quite recently, like the leader of Kazakhstan. So he's increasingly, he and the country are increasingly isolated. I actually watched his speech from the year 2000 yesterday, the first time that he spoke at this parade, and it's amazing. It's amazing the change in some ways that he talks about the resilience of the war generation and how this resilience helped to create a free and democratic Russia. And that was really the attitude when he took over. The Soviet period is over. We're free and open now, and that is something to be celebrated. I mean, democracy was certainly not a word that he used in his speech today. So it's quite amazing to watch back that speech 22 years later.
And he has been in many ways the lucky beneficiary of military reforms. There's about a third, certainly a third of ground forces, and it's pretty similar for airborne or air forces as well in the Russian armed forces today. That is old, it's legacy, that's from the Soviet days. Only a third that is not from those days. Only a third that has either come into service since then or has been updated. And there was a big reform in 2008 called New Look in the Russian military armed forces to try and professionalise. At that point they reduced the length of service for a conscript from 2 years down to 18 months. It then came down to 12 months. They tried to invest in more forces, so the submarine service and the Navy a bit more broadly benefited from that. Ground forces much less so. So he has inherited a military in transition, but what they've done is they've bought kit, they've bought stuff, but they've just not worked on all the other elements of military power. They've just not worked on the training and integration of all the forces. So have you seen something?
No, I was just going to say that what he's doing now is laying flowers on these stones that carry the names of what are called hero cities in Russia. It's cities that have particularly sustained loss of life in the Second World War, some of which he mentioned in his speech. So you're seeing names like Smolensk, Murmansk in the Arctic Circle, Moscow, and I think there's a Kiev down here as well.
It would be interesting if he does lay. Is Kiev on one of the smaller stones there?
No, it will be sort of one of those larger ones that he's laid the flowers on. We certainly saw Odessa there, which is part of Ukraine now.
Yeah.
Or was then.
Interesting. No public at this bit. No public lining the. I mean, they wouldn't be that close anyway, but to the street, 100 yards away or so. That is the flame on the tomb of the eternal warrior. There will be, even though we can't see much of it, there will be a lot of security around this whole event. We saw photographs over the weekend of snipers up on the roofs overlooking Red Square. This will be very tightly controlled. I mean, who would have been invited to sit and watch the parade in Red Square? That would just be invite only. That is the end of the live feed as we've taken it from Moscow. You've been watching Telegraph's live coverage of the Russian Victory Day parade from Red Square in Moscow, with me, Dominic Nichols, Defence and Security Editor, and Theo Mers, Assistant Foreign Editor. We've now got some footage here that's in Minsk in Belarus, a very close ally to Russia. Although interestingly, President Lukashenko was actually mildly critical of the war in Ukraine last week. There he is, there's Lukashenko. But the last footage we saw Mr. Putin on the main dais in Red Square. He gave his speech, which was a bit more aggressive, a bit more bullish than we were expecting, but didn't go as far as some had suggested that he might declare war in order to mobilise Russian society more broadly. But it was quite a punchy speech. Most notably, the air parade. The air part of the parade was cancelled due to bad weather. I mean, yeah, the weather looked okay. There was possibly low cloud, but we don't know if that was because they didn't have the numbers of aircraft, or they would have had to display a very aging fleet. We're not sure. But the air parade was cancelled, and these pictures are now coming from the Belarusian capital, because of course Victory Day events are marked in many towns and cities across Russia and in countries close to Russia.
It's a public holiday throughout the former Soviet Union, and Putin stressed in his speech that it was a Soviet victory, as he always does. He also name-checked the US, the UK and France's role in defeating Nazi Germany, which for him he certainly intended to be read as a gesture of magnanimity after he was or a gesture of support after he was saying how the US has never recognised the Soviet role in the war effort, and how the US and its junior partners are now moving to attack Russia. So what we're seeing here is in Belarus. I don't know what weaponry, if any, we're going to be seeing here, but it is a massive march of, this is what they call the Immortal Regiment in Russia. It's a tradition that actually only started a few years ago in Moscow and is now obviously carried on to Belarus. It's where families hold up pictures of loved ones who were lost in the Second World War. And we heard from Russia this week that families had also been invited to hold up pictures of loved ones that had died in Ukraine, which is surprising in some ways, because Russia has been trying to cover up deaths, or well, if not cover up deaths, then certainly play them down, not being communicative with families. So it was surprising that the relatives of soldiers were asked to, or said that they could acknowledge this so publicly. I wonder if that. I wonder how many of them will have done so.
I mean, they have. Russia has admitted casualty figures, widely disputed and thought to be very, very low, but they have announced the number of deaths in Ukraine. So, in many ways, it's not particularly surprising that that was referenced again today, and families invited to march for the Immortal Regiment, families of victims in Ukraine. But I mean, it might be a subtle shift towards steering the public towards a view that this campaign is ongoing. And Putin's not known massively for his subtlety, so I don't know if that's a good analysis. But it's certainly far short of where we were possibly expecting him to go with talk of war and wider mobilisation and preparing the economy and so on and so forth. There was nothing that hinted towards that at all.
This is Alexander Lukashenko, the dictator of Belarus. He is remarkably still in power 2 years after these mass protests against his rule. I think he's been around for 26 or 27 years now. It really looked like he was on the way out, but he was propped up in many ways by Putin with a lot of financial and political backing. And Putin is really his only ally at the moment. But despite this, even he has had some questions, as Dom was saying, about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. He said last week that he thought the war was dragging on, and he would do everything he can to end it. He said that he is the only person who can bring Russia and Ukraine to the table for peace talks. I don't know if that is true or not. But he certainly wasn't entirely backing the Russian war there, which was surprising given how isolated he otherwise is.
And there have been suggestions that there's a section of society in Belarus who are very, very opposed to the war and prepared to take action. There's a number of... Well, Ben Wallace, the British Defence Secretary, said last week that Belarus had a problem with its exploding rail lines. There have been a number of railway lines who are either sabotaged or subject to landslips or goodness knows what, but meant that the Russian forces that then moved out of Ukraine after the retreat from the north, the failed attack on Kyiv in the north, moved back into Belarus in order to reconstitute and move around through Russia to start the fight or contribute to the fight in the Donbass. A lot of them have been unable to do so. They've been unable to move a lot of freight by rail because, as Mr. Wallace said, the Belarusian rail lines seem to keep exploding. There's been suggestions through the press that this is action by the members of society in Belarus who are opposed to the war. We've not seen anything quite that on that scale in Russia. But I don't think. I think that's largely, those things are largely semantics. I mean, there's you barely get a fag paper between Lukashenko and Putin. I mean, very close allies. This man, to a very great extent, is only where he is because of Putin, and he knows it. So, I mean, he will make these mildly critical comments, I think, as a way of showing his independence, which I think is a bit of a hollow argument.
This on the left is Nikolai Lukashenko, the son of Alexander, who is. There's a lot of speculation that he has been groomed to take over and continue Lukashenko rule. There's been that speculation for years and years. Ever since he was quite a young boy, he'd be taken out with his dad to official events. So that seems to be the if Alexander Lukashenko has anything to do with it, he's likely to be the next leader of Belarus. Remains to be seen whether that will actually happen. Though it's interesting sort of seeing him here and seeing this potential successor. You're struck with the fact that in Moscow at the Victory Day parade there's no one who seems like a potential successor to Putin, who's been in power so long. You wonder who could possibly take over. Shoigu, his defence minister, who we saw there, who is popular. There have been some suggestion that he might be able to take over at some point, but there's nobody lined up.
Do you think those pictures we saw from Moscow a few moments ago of Putin and Shoigu very, very close together, pointedly close together, no one else getting close to the president? Do you think that was a message to say that Shoigu is the closest to Vladimir Putin? There had been speculation a few weeks ago Shoigu had had a heart attack because he hadn't been seen for a couple of weeks. Now maybe he did have a heart attack, but at the time some people were saying, "Oh my God, he's trying to launch a coup and he's been rubbed out by Putin." Clearly nonsense. But I wonder if today's display was very obviously saying he's in favour. He may never have been out of it, but he's the guy closest to Putin, literally and figuratively. Shoigu's the only person Putin's going to be listening to.
Yeah, I think it shows that he is close to Putin. At least they're projecting the image that they're on good terms. They historically have been quite close. I think they've even been on a fishing trip together. I remember seeing a couple of years ago pictures of them in Siberia in the woods, looking like they're having a good time. So this is there certainly is the image from the Kremlin that they are close together. But I think it is dangerous to read too much into these things because, as you say, Shoigu disappeared for I think more than a couple of weeks near the start of the conflict, which was a very strange thing to happen for the defence minister of a country at war. And then he did resurface and obviously is still in there with the Kremlin, but we never really got an explanation for that. So I think it's impossible to know really, though it is interesting that he was the only figure walking with Putin.
You were verging on an accidental partridge there with your fishing trip. Lynn, idea. Shoigu and Putin fishing weekends.
Yeah. Well, not sure it would have been that funny really going on. I'm not sure I'd want to go on a fishing trip with Shoigu and Putin. But
yeah, he might not come back.
Беларусь помнит и повторяет эти слова снова и снова. В церемонии возложения принимают участие наши юные патриоты, артисты эстрады. Также мы видим представителей дипломатического корпуса, представителей исполнительного комитета СНГ, духовенства. В нашей многонациональной стране мирно живут люди разных вероисповеданий. Во время войны православные, католики, мусульмане, иудеи также героически сражались плечом к плечу. Низкий поклон всем, кто добывал для нас мир.
Великая Отечественная война – это наша общая боль. И наша общая победа над коричневой чумой. Какими бы ни были переговоры в течение года, зарубежные делегации всегда находят время поклониться памятным местам.
Подножие обелиска уже утопает в цветах. К возложению присоединяются общественные объединения и политические партии, также активисты и патриоты Беларуси.
Как всегда, представительный состав. Это люди, которые гордо несли знамя Белоруссии и достойно проявили себя, в том числе и во время событий лета-осени непростого 2020-го. И продолжают работать на укрепление имиджа государства.
Место силы белорусов, площадь Победы, до ноября 1958-го называлась Круглой. Затем была переименована, хотя многие старожилы минчане ее так и называют и по сей день.
Памятник был сооружен в 1954 году. И в 80-х здесь были установлены постаменты с капсулами с землей из 12 городов-героев, а также из Брестской крепости.
Весь архитектурный ансамбль с вечным огнем и 38-метровым гранитным обелиском – это место нашей силы. И не только для белорусов, для всех народов, причастных к Великой Победе.
Hello, for those who have recently joined us, you are watching the Telegraph's live coverage of the Victory Day celebrations. These pictures coming to you now are actually from Belarus, from Minsk, the capital of Belarus. The feed has been cut from Russia. We watched for about an hour and a half. We watched Mr. Putin lead the parade in Red Square in Moscow. His speech was fairly bombastic. Bit of a fire breather, but stopped short of declaring war or calling for a general mobilisation from the Russian public. He did refer to the war a lot. He referred to NATO in fairly stark and vicious terms. It was quite a, like I say, quite a fire breather of a speech, but stopped short of going as far as some commentators thought he might have done. The parade itself was fairly short. There were about a third fewer vehicles than we were expecting, and the air parade was completely cancelled, ostensibly for bad weather, but it didn't look that bad to us. I'll remind you, these pictures are from Belarus. This is not the weather in Russia. There was a bit of cloud cover in Russia. But he said some interesting things, and notably, he stuck very, very close to Sergei Shoigu, his defence minister. No one else really got a look in with the president. I'm joined by Theo Merz, our assistant foreign editor, fluent Russian speaker, thank goodness. Theo, what stuck out for you from the speech?
I think what stuck out for me is that he hasn't really changed the terms of the war. He's been repeating what he's been saying since the start of the conflict. The Russia is in fact under attack from the West. That NATO was planning to encroach on Russia's territory, including Crimea. He said that would be an attack on Russia itself. What really stood out for me is that he's been doing these speeches sort of on and off for 22 years now, and normally there is this focus on the victory over Nazi Germany and the victory generation, as he calls them, and then there'll be a sort of sprinkling of contemporary politics in there, and he'll talk about how Russophobia is on the rise, or whatever it is he wants to talk about at that time. But this time, what was interesting is he only spoke for a few sentences about victory in the Second World War, and then was immediately onto a speech that sounded like it could have been an address to NATO leaders, that this clearly was not aimed at the veterans or the soldiers who were on that square. He was speaking very much to the West and laying out Russia's position again. So as Dom has said, there's not an escalation. We're not seeing an escalation now from that speech, which isn't to say it won't happen later today or in the coming days, but we're definitely not seeing Russia backing down in any way. This is going to continue probably for a long time.
But there were very few tanks on parade today, very few armoured fighting vehicles. We saw the Russia's main nuclear missile, the intercontinental ballistic missile, the Yars, as expected, but notably absent was the air parade, and also there were very, very few other vehicles. It really didn't take that long. These parades are normally used also as a grand display of military capability, and it was not quite there. There was only one T-34 tank. The T-34 was Russia's main tank by the end of the Second World War anyway, and it was mass produced. It was a very good tank, held in great esteem still to today. But there was only one on parade. There's normally a few more than that. So the whole thing felt very scaled down. There's been discussion. We ourselves have commented on the fact that there's a huge amount of Russian military hardware deployed in Ukraine, and a lot of it has been lost. We think Russia went into Ukraine with about 25 to 30% of its entire ground force. Sorry, no, forgive me, about 70% of its entire ground force, and has lost around 16% of its entire army, which is a huge figure and unsustainable. Those losses are unsustainable. So maybe that was a knock on what we saw today, that there were far fewer vehicles than we were expecting. We saw the new vehicles, so the T-14 Armata tank. Well, I say it's new. We first saw it in 2015. So, you know, it in and of itself is getting on a little bit and has never been mass produced. It's not out in the wider Russian army in any great numbers. So, yeah, a fairly muted parade today in all our areas other than the speech. Maybe that's why the speech was a little bit harder than normal to make up for the lack elsewhere of capability. But we're now watching the feed from Belarus. Mr. Lukashenko, leader of Belarus, is speaking on their Victory Day parade.
Though what we saw in Moscow on Red Square, as Don was saying, was a little bit scaled back compared to previous years, though that's just a fraction of what is going on around Russia and across the former Soviet Union, that there are smaller parades and smaller marches and celebrations happening, not just in big cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg in Siberia, but relatively small towns and even villages. There'll be celebrations to mark this. So what we've seen now is not the beginning and end of what is happening in Russia on May the 9th. And like I've said, there may be further announcements today, either from the Kremlin or the Defense Ministry or the army, about what is going to happen in Ukraine. It's also interesting to compare this to how Ukraine is marking this day, because it was part of that Soviet victory, and there will be events in Kiev. And Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, as we know, put out an address, his own Victory Day address yesterday, when he was talking about Nazism returning to Ukraine again in the form of the Russian army. It was an emotional address, as Putin has done, drawing on history to say that we are used to defeating these Nazis and we will do it again. So it was very interesting to see the two leaders using that threat of Nazism and using that memory of the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany for their own ends. Though, of course, Zelensky was doing it in a rather pared down way, just in a t-shirt in front of a bombed out building, and then we see Putin in this huge ceremony surrounded by generals. So very different images there.
And there was never any chance that President Zelensky was not going to mark it. But it had to be done, even in the very difficult circumstances he's in Kyiv, because this battle for the narrative, Putin's trying to say, we are the ones fighting Nazis. We fought them then, we're fighting them today in the Donbass and elsewhere in Ukraine. So it was absolutely important that President Zelensky and others say, you are not the mantle holders of the fight against Nazism,
exactly.
And you do not get to own this idea that only you are standing up against this tidal wave of Nazism sweeping Europe then, now as then. So it had to happen, and it was interesting. I thought in Putin's speech how he did reference. He came out the blocks very quickly and was quite strident in his anti-American rhetoric, and then much later on in the speech there was a. Oh yes, and some other people turned up as well. America, France, Europe, to Britain to fight the Nazis. But yes, he's trying to couch it in terms of he's holding up the wall against this tide of Nazism.
Yeah, it's interesting that Putin. I don't think Putin actually mentioned Ukraine or Kiev at all in his speech. He talked about the Donbass, but he wasn't. It's interesting that he didn't say that word. I'd need to check it. I need to check it back to be sure. But But yes, so I don't think. I think we'll see how this actually shapes the war, sort of in the hours or maybe even the days to come. I don't think it didn't seem to me that what we've seen or heard today has had a military significance. I don't know what you think.
I don't think it's had military significance necessarily. I think it's an interesting point to mark in this war, mainly for things that were absent rather than things that were there. So absent the equipment and the Air Force and a lot of or any reference to widening the war. So it's not been without controversy and talking point, but I don't think it necessarily sets a new direction for this war. But on that note, we'd like to thank you all for watching. We would love to stay in touch with you. You can get us all the usual places and our Telegraph addresses, or on Twitter and other social media. Thank you very much for watching. Theo, thank you for keeping us on the straight and narrow and doing a live translation, which I thought was very interesting.
Thanks very much.
On my capabilities.
Okay. Yeah.
So from the Telegraph offices here in London, thank you for watching.
Thanks.
And a very good morning.
Афганистане, а теперь в нашей Украине. Последователи нацистов одержимы идеей реванша, но открыто сражаться с наследниками советского народа не готовы. Хорошо усвоили уроки, видимо, поэтому накачивают Украину оружием, воюют с мемориалами, символами, ветеранами, узниками концлагерей и даже их семьями. В самом страшном сне невозможно было представить, что там, в этой братской нам стране, чудом выжившей под сапогом фашистских оккупантов, нацизм снова поднимет голову.